Evaluating Magic cards can be a tricky thing. Even the most experienced players can't always look at a card and figure out whether or not it's going to be good. This is because Magic is an incredibly complex game, and without actually playing with the cards, it can be difficult to figure out how powerful the effects they have actually are. One of the most notable examples of this is Delver of Secrets. Many people thought it was going to be terrible. After all, it's a 1-mana 1/1 that needs to meet a condition to ever be relevant. But in the end, the Delver turned out to be way easier to transform than people thought, and it's effectively a 1-mana 3/2 flyer, which is pretty insane. Delver went on to become a multi-format all-star. So, evaluating how good a card is going to be is tough, but I think it can also be quite difficult to look at older Magic cards and figure out how good they used to be. This is because if you don't know the metagame and the power level of the cards in their original context, you aren't really going to understand the card. A few weeks ago, I took a look at exactly this kind of card. That is, 10 cards that don't look very good to us today, but were actually quite good in their original context, and there are way more than 10 cards out there that fall into this group. So in this MTG Top 10, I'm going to look at 10 more cards that look terrible to today's players, but were once so good they were quite successful in competitive Magic. While most of my top 10s use rankings, that's not really the case here because this list is super subjective. These are just 10 cards that look bad today but used to be great, in no particular order. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Let's start with the most recent card on the list, by far, Goldnight Castigator. For 2 generic and 2 red, it's a very impressive 4/9 with haste and flying, but the rest of the text box is entirely downside. Damage dealt to you is doubled, and damage dealt to the Castigator is doubled too. When I make worst lists that the Castigator is eligible for, like Worst Angels or Worst Mythic Rares, I usually get multiple comments shocked that the Castigator was left off of the list, and I don't blame people for feeling that way. At first glance, this card's downside does seem insurmountable. I mean, sure, maybe you're getting in for 4 at a time, but surely your opponent is absolutely annihilating you on the backswing, right? Given the downside, some of you are probably wondering if the game plan is actually to donate the Castigator to the opponent and then wreck them. After all, that's the only reason people ever play this card in Commander, right? But that wasn't the case in 60-card formats. Goldnight Castigator saw play as a legitimate aggro creature in Standard between 2016 and 2017. At first, that might seem crazy, but this creature does represent an incredibly quick clock in the air. While damage dealt to the Castigator is doubled, its massive toughness still takes a really big creature or a burn spell that does at least 5 to take it down. Roast was a commonly played card that would normally be able to do it, except it could only hit ground creatures. So the fact that the Castigator could take double damage itself actually very rarely came up. Furthermore, one of the most heavily played cards in that format, and one that absolutely destroyed aggro decks, was Languish. And the Castigator gave aggro decks access to a super aggressive creature who could shrug it off and do the last 4 or 8 damage to the opponent. And against those decks, they aren't really damaging you until later in the game anyway, and the Castigator was great at finishing them off before they could ever reap the reward of doing double damage to you. The Castigator saw main deck play for about half of its top 8s and was a sideboard card in the others, one that could be brought in against decks that had no answers for this very strange card. Overall, despite all appearances, Castigator was quite successful in its time in Standard, and I think it's actually a perfectly designed card, where the downside was well worth the upside in the card's original context. Now, let's look at Jackal Pup. Like Goldnight Castigator, this is an aggressive red creature that comes with a downside that hurts you. For 1 red mana, it's a 2/1, and whenever it's dealt damage, it does that much damage to you. This is perhaps the most famous card that isn't considered good today, but was actually really good in its original context. Unlike many of the cards in this list, which were very good because of a really specific metagame or deck, Jackal Pup was simply the best red 1-drop in the game for a very, very long time. It was one of the key cards that helped birth mono-red aggro decks, called Sly back in the day, and red deck wins these days. And decks like that have been a fixture in Magic since the late 1990s. So while today a 1-mana 2/1 with downside seems really bad, back then it was one of the most efficient creatures around. And while the downside certainly came up sometimes, the goal of the deck was to do a ton of damage to the opponent before it ever mattered that you might get damaged by your own Jackal Pups. Playing the pup was the ideal turn 1 play in the deck because it could do so much damage so quickly in a format where there weren't really any better 1-drops to speak of. Back then, anything that cost 1 mana and had 2 power came with a downside, apart from Savannah Lions, and at the time, that was definitely the right way to design these cards, as 1 mana 2 power creatures were such a boon for aggro decks. If there were too many around that didn't have downsides, those decks would have been too powerful. So yeah, these days we get 1 mana 2/1s with all kinds of upside, and that makes a card like this one look pretty bad. But in an era where 1 mana 2 power creatures were exceedingly rare, Jackal Pup was actually considered one of the best 1-drops in the entire game. Next, let's look at Jhovall Queen. For 4 generic and 2 white, she's a 4/7 with Vigilance, and that's it. An understated creature with only 1 keyword isn't very exciting to us today, but between 2000 and 2001, Jhovall Queen put up lots of major top 8s. That might seem ridiculous for what today looks like a 6-mana creature with only minor upside. However, there were a few things going on back then that helped make the Queen a viable competitive card. First, it's always important to mention that creature stat lines were significantly worse at the time, so Jhovall Queen was kind of a reasonable body for the year 2000. Additionally, the block and standard formats at the time were relatively underpowered, since the mistakes Wizards of the Coast made in Urza's block, which resulted in tons of bans and restrictions, caused them to make cards weaker on the whole. However, that alone probably still wouldn't have been enough for Jhovall Queen to be so successful. More significantly, Jhovall Queen saw play because of her creature type, Rebel. Rebels were a creature type from Mask's block, and most of them came with the powerful ability to recruit other rebels from your deck and put them directly on the battlefield. This meant all of them were very legit value engines that could allow you to continue to add to the board without having to commit any resources from your hand. What's more is, as you went up the curve with them, you got more and more powerful rebels because each creature you grabbed could search up rebels of higher mana value. This chain featured both Lyn Civvy and Ramosian Sky Marshal, both of which could grab Jhovall Queen, which largely appeared as a single copy that you could tutor up in the later stages of the game. Rebel strategies were highly successful in both block and standard, so much so that Lyn Civvy actually ended up getting banned in block constructed. Without that powerful centerpiece, Jhovall Queen stopped seeing play, but between 2000 and 2001, she was the biggest, most effective attacker in one of the most powerful decks in the format. Now let's have a look at Stinging Barrier. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's a 0/4 with Defender, and you can pay 1 blue mana to do 1 damage to any target. While I think we can all agree that pinging is a pretty useful effect, it gets way worse when you have to spend mana on it, and having it on a 4 mana 0/4 seems pretty awful. However, Stinging Barrier was actually pretty important in block and standard, in part for the exact same reasons Jhovall Queen was. That might sound super strange, because the barrier isn't a rebel, but that's because the barrier wasn't part of those dominant rebel decks. Instead, it was part of the decks that were created to counter them. Rebels were so busted, especially in block, that the entire format was made up only of rebel decks and the decks that were meant to counter them, and the barrier was one of the key cards for doing the latter. Its massive toughness could stonewall almost every rebel in the deck other than Jhovall Queen and Ramosian Sky Marshal, which only showed up in the late game. It could also pick off several rebels in the deck, including Ramosian Sergeant and Defiant Falcon. Basically, it slowed the game down for them in a big way, and once it had done that for you, the deck would drop Rising Waters, which would lock down both players' lands. The barrier was great when that happened, since Rising Waters only lets you untap 1 land per turn. You could use that 1 land to ping your opponent until they died, while they would have an incredibly difficult time pressuring you with their rebels, with their lands only untapping very slowly. It performed a similar role in blue decks in Standard that would use Opposition and Static Orb to make sure the opponent could never use their mana effectively. In short, the barrier lined up surprisingly well against rebels and was an ideal card in decks with prison elements at the time, since it could protect you while you deployed your lock pieces. So, it might not look like much today, but back in the early 2000s, the barrier was a key card showing up in multiple formats, and it even won a Pro Tour. Phyrexian Colossus is another card that doesn't look so good today. It's 7 generic mana for an 8/8 that can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. That's a pretty great evasive ability that makes it unblockable on many boards. However, it also doesn't untap during your untap step, but you can untap it by paying 8 life. Sounds like a great deal, right? As with Jackal Pup, this is a creature that was designed in an era where you just couldn't get creatures with stats this good that didn't come with the downside. A 7 mana 8/8 that was hard to block was pretty much unheard of at the time. Also, like the pup, they decided to power it down by making it so that if you actually wanted to use it, you're going to need to put your life total in jeopardy. However, the block standard and extended of the late 1990s and early 2000s had just the right assortment of cards for the Colossus to be an incredibly powerful win condition. Urza's block was loaded with incredibly powerful artifacts and artifact payoffs that could minimize Phyrexian Colossus's downside. First, it was really easy to get it into play ahead of schedule. This could be achieved with Tolarian Academy, a land that gives you 1 blue mana for each artifact you control, but the even more broken way to do this was with Tinker, a spell that lets you sacrifice an artifact to search one up and put it directly on the battlefield. These decks could easily put a turn 2 Colossus into play, and even though it comes with a downside, if you got it down that early and swung with it 3 times, your opponent would be dead before you were. And his evasion is extra scary in the early game too, so stopping him in combat is a near impossibility. In addition to Tinker and Academy, there were a ton of powerful mana rocks like Grim Monolith and Thran Dynamo, which gave you another way to rapidly accelerate your mana, especially alongside Voltaic Key, which could not only untap these mana rocks to power out the Colossus, it could also untap the big 8/8 without you having to spend any life on it at all. Yeah, artifact decks at the time were absolutely busted, so much so that several of the cards I mentioned, apart from the Colossus and Thran Dynamo, ended up getting banned in multiple formats. Phyrexian Colossus definitely played a role in this, since it was, at the time, the most frightening Tinker target in the game, and players putting it into play early was incredibly hard to beat. Next, let's look at Erhnam Djinn, another creature that was hugely efficient for its time, but came with a seemingly massive downside. The Djinn is 3 generic and a green for a 4/5, but at the beginning of your upkeep you have to give a non-wall creature an opponent controls Forest Walk until your next upkeep. That's right, the Djinn has to make one of your opponent's creatures unblockable every turn. That definitely doesn't sound like it's worth it for a 4 mana 4/5 today, but make no mistake, this card was a powerhouse in its heyday and was certainly one of the best creatures in the game between 1994 and 1997. Decks did come with ways to get around the downside. More on that in a minute, but there were very few creatures being played in the early days of Magic who could outrace or block the Djinn effectively. Even Serra Angel, which cost 1 more mana, couldn't win the race, and she was considered the best creature in the game at the time. So, there were many decks that ran the Djinn, and didn't even do that much to mitigate against the downside. But it became truly absurd when you did have ways to shut it off, because you held on to your super efficient creature and never even had to worry about Forest Walk. Decks looking to go this route made sure they didn't actually have a forest in play. That might sound hard to do in a deck that's casting Erhnam Djinn, but it really wasn't. The most notable strategy involving the Djinn was a deck called Erhnam Djinn, which was an aggro deck that looked to get above-rate creatures like the Djinn on the board before casting Armageddon to annihilate all lands. That meant you no longer had forests around for Forest Walk to ever be relevant, and your opponent was likely defenseless because they had no mana. Zuron Orb and Balance worked in a similar manner. The Orb could let you give up forests for life, and when combined with Balance, you could blow up both players' lands since you could float your mana, sacrifice the lands, and then cast Balance, which forces players to sacrifice lands until they have the same number in play as the person with the fewest. So, while we might look at this card and not think it's worth 4 mana, people were more than happy to spend that mana on the Djinn between 1994 and 1997. Let's look at another green creature now, Whirling Dervish. For 2 green mana, it's a 1/1 with protection from black, and at the beginning of each end step, if it dealt damage to an opponent this turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. While protection from black is nice against the right opponent, the Dervish starts so small that you wouldn't really feel like you're doing anything that impressive today if you were just getting in with this every turn, even against a mono black deck. However, the Dervish was a pretty good creature that saw lots of play in Standard between 1994 and 1997, making it another card to appear in the top 8 of Magic's very first World Championship. So what was going on that Whirling Dervish was so good for the first few years of competitive Magic? Well, for one thing, most of the best removal in the game couldn't hit it. Swords to Plowshares and Lightning Bolt could, but that's about it. Furthermore, black was an incredibly commonly played color in the early days of Magic, so this actually largely saw play in the main deck. Dark Ritual, Hypnotic Spectre was common during this time, and by 1997 Necropotence decks had emerged, making black decks top tier during the entire time Whirling Dervish was active. So in a world with less efficient creatures, a 2-mana 1/1 that was unkillable and unblockable against most of the field was pretty good, and when the Dervish starts to become an inevitable source of ever-increasing damage, It can get black decks in a lot of trouble, especially if they're trying to pay life to draw a bunch of cards with necropotence. While Whirling Dervish saw most of its play between 1994 and 1997, it actually had a resurgence in 2007 as a result of a reprint. This time around, it was a sideboard card, as creatures were a lot better by 2007, but it was still a worthy sideboard card for bringing in against people playing black. Basically, if you were playing a powerful black deck during Magic's earliest days of competitive Magic, and many people were, seeing Whirling Dervish on the board on turn 2 was actually pretty scary. It's pretty amusing to think that decks running Dark Ritual and Necropotence, two of the most broken cards of all time, were so afraid of this little 2-drop. Next, let's look at Avarax. It's 3 generic mana and 2 red for a 3/3 with haste, and when it enters the battlefield you can search your library for another Avarax and put it into your hand. You can also pay 1 generic and a red to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. I think most players today look at this card and think it's terrible. After all, the stats are bad, so why would anyone ever want another copy of a 5 mana 3/3? Well, today it probably would be bad because it's so expensive. But this card does grant you card advantage in a pretty big way, and you can even chain multiple Avaraxes together. That doesn't sound great, but this creature was only a little bit behind the curve back in 2002, at which time it was pretty comparable to the more recent Squadron Hawk, a card that is more universally recognized as a really good card. If you ignore what looks like a very efficient creature today and just focus on the card advantage, it becomes clear that this card isn't too bad, especially in its original context. It was one of the most heavily played cards at the Onslaught block constructed Pro Tour in 2003, showing up not only in a beast deck that could generate even more value out of Avarax's creature type with Ravenous Baloth and other beast payoffs, but it also appeared in decks like Goblins, despite not being a goblin, and control decks like Astral Slide. So while you may look at this card today and think, why would I ever want another copy of this card in my hand? Back in 2003 and 2004, it was a pretty great 5 mana creature. Now let's talk about Thieving Magpie, which is actually one of my favorite Magic cards of all time. It's kind of similar to Avarax in that it's seemingly understated, but it can grant some serious card advantage. It's 2 generic and 2 blue for a 1/3 flyer, and when it does combat damage to an opponent, you get to draw a card. It's hard to imagine ever getting in with such a small creature today, but Thieving Magpie was a key card in a mono blue deck that was actually named for this little kleptomaniac. That might sound crazy, but remember, in my last video where I looked at cards that look bad today but were once really good, I talked about how Ivory Gargoyle was a great win condition at the time, and obviously the Magpie is a step up from that. Basically, if you can find a way to get in with this creature, you can use the extra cards it gives you to protect it and keep the skies clear. So while it may take a while, you really could win the game with Thieving Magpie in those decks. It saw play in Standard in that eponymous deck that sought to do exactly that, packing tons of counterspells including Forbid. This counterspell comes with buyback, and while it had the steep cost of discarding 2 cards for you to return it to your hand, the Magpie helped you get those extra cards. And this deck could indefinitely leave mana up and play the same counterspell every single turn if it wanted to. The deck also used Capsize, which could be used to bounce lands in the early game and make it harder for your opponent to defend themselves from the Magpie, and by the late game you could pay its buyback cost and cast it every single turn. Thieving Magpie was so good in the Standard of 1999 and 2000, more copies of it appeared in control decks than did Morphling. And that's saying something when we're talking about what was considered by many the best creature in Magic at the time, but it makes sense when you think about it. Your Magpies could help you find your Morphlings after all. After having lots of success in more typical control decks in Standard, the Magpie transitioned in 2001 into being played in opposition static orb decks. These decks could use opposition to keep the skies clear for the Magpie to do its stuff, and the more cards you drew, the tighter your hold on your opponent would become. So while it may seem understated today, Thieving Magpie drew control and prison players a whole lot of cards between 1999 and 2002, and helped them win many games. And last but not least, it's Jade Statue. For 4 generic mana, it's an artifact with an activated ability that costs 2 generic, and it makes the statue become a 3/6 until end of combat, and you can only use that ability during combat. This does mean that you can activate it at the beginning of combat before attackers or blockers are declared, but still. How does paying 6 total mana for a temporary 3/6 sound to you? Yeah, not good. Not good at all. But despite how awful this card appears to be, it achieved a top 8 at Magic's very first World Championship in 1994, appearing as a full 4 of in Dominic Simmons' deck. So, what was going on that made this card not only a worthwhile inclusion, but a World Championship worthy card? Well, there were a few factors at play. First off, games for the most part were slow and grindy affairs at the time. While there was fast mana available, and occasionally someone would pull off the Channel Fireball combo, cards were restricted to keep you from having completely absurd starts like that, and actually damaging the opponent down to 0 took a while when the best creature in the format was Serra Angel. That combination of fast mana and a slow format meant you had more time and mana to activate Jade Statue repeatedly. But it was actually a pretty good metagame call against those aforementioned Serra Angel control decks. This is because, sort of like we saw in the last video with Chimeric Idol, the statue only being a creature when you wanted it to be helped it dodge some of the most powerful cards in the format, like Control Magic and Wrath of God. It also worked really well against Meatstone, a card Serra Angel decks could use to great effect since it would shut down all the other decently sized creatures in the format, but because Serra Angel had what was then the unique ability to not have to tap to attack, it would dodge the stone. But so would Jade Statue, because it was never a creature during your untap step. Furthermore, the statue's toughness was incredibly high for the time, and it could stand up to any ground creature your opponent might throw at you, like Jhovall Djinn and Erhnam Djinn, which were viewed as two of the best aggro creatures in the game at the time, and Jade Statue wasn't worried about either of them. It was also immune to most of the removal in the set not named Swords to Plowshares, because damage-based removal couldn't take it down, and black removal spells like Terror couldn't kill it. It's definitely true that Jade Statue is pretty much never worth playing, except at Magic's very first World Championship, an event which marked the birth of sanctioned competitive Magic, and Jade Statue was part of it. So those are 10 cards that don't look very good today, but were once super powerful. If you want to own any of these cards to relive their heyday, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including another one in the same vein as the ones on this list, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.